Snow fell in heavy flakes on the pier as the trucks rolled in, their engines coughing plumes of smoke into the cold evening air. The women inside were pressed shoulder to shoulder, their wool coats stiff with sea salt from the voyage, their hands raw from the Atlantic wind. They had been told very little. Some imagined the iron bars of a dungeon. Others whispered that they would be lined up and shot as punishment for wearing the enemy's uniform. No one spoke loudly. Silence itself felt safer than misplaced hope. When the tailgate finally dropped, the first thing they saw was not barbed wire but a line of American soldiers in khaki, holding steaming metal trays that glistened with something they could not yet identify. The smell hit before the sight made sense. Butter, rich and golden, seeping into warm bread. Roasted meat, carved in thick slices. And somewhere, impossibly, a sweet tang of cranberries. One of the younger prisoners, no more than 19, muttered a confused prayer. It was as though the scent had broken through the wall of her hunger and slipped directly into her soul. Her comrade beside her, older, gaunt, with streaks of gray that war had painted on her prematurely, tightened her grip on the girl's arm. "Careful," she hissed. "This must be a trick." Yet the soldiers only gestured for them to come forward. They stumbled out of the truck bed like ghosts from another world. Their boots crunched over gravel slick with snowmelt. For years, meals had meant crusts, ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley, thin soup stretched to invisibility. Tonight, in a country that had been their sworn enemy, they were confronted with abundance so obscene it bordered on cruel. White bowls of mashed potatoes, clouds of steam rising as if from another universe. Thick slices of turkey, their edges browned and crisp. A bottle of red wine catching the lantern light like captured flame. The guard said little, their expressions impassive, though one or two smiled politely in ways that unsettled the prisoners even more. Politeness could be another weapon. The women shuffled forward, clutching their coats, each hesitant to reach for what was offered. One brave soul, a former nurse with hands still trembling from tending to shrapnel wounds on the Eastern Front, took the plate first. The soldiers waited. She raised a forkful to her mouth. It was warm, salty, real. Her eyes welled before she could stop them. And then, as if permission had been granted, the line moved faster, each woman accepting a plate, still looking around for the hidden cruelty that surely must follow. Inside the barracks, the tables had been set with tin cups, napkins folded in neat triangles, and even sprigs of pine laid down the center. The contrast was almost grotesque. Back home, Dresden and Hamburg had been reduced to blackened skeletons. Children gnawed on potato peels salvaged from garbage heaps. Here, enemy soldiers were being offered holiday dinners. It felt like stumbling into a dream scripted by irony itself. Conversation was hushed at first. Forks scraped softly. Then, gradually, laughter cracked through the silence, sharp and brittle, but unmistakable. One woman whispered to another that the Americans must be fattening them up like Christmas geese. Another muttered that perhaps the wine was poisoned. A third, chewing slowly on mashed potatoes slick with butter, declared that if death came after such a mouthful, it was worth the price. Their laughter spread, mingling with the clink of cutlery and the distant hum of a phonograph somewhere in the camp. The guards walked among them, collecting trays, refilling cups. They treated the women as though they were guests rather than prisoners, though the barbed wire outside still glistened with frost. That duality gnawed at the prisoners' hearts. Were they captives or honored visitors? The contradiction itself was unbearable, yet strangely intoxicating. Some of the women tried to sit straighter, as though dignity could be reclaimed with posture alone. Others simply ate, tears streaming unchecked, remembering brothers who had starved in the ruins of Stalingrad, fathers who had wasted away in shelters beneath collapsed roofs. It was not just the food. It was the implication. Here, in the land they had been taught to despise, their humanity was being acknowledged in the simplest, most undeniable way. Each bite was a quiet rebellion against everything they had been told about cruelty, about vengeance, about what awaited them across the ocean. And yet suspicion lingered. A kindness this generous could not be free. Surely, it had a hidden cost. When the meal ended, the women were led to bunks stacked neatly in rows. The mattresses were stuffed with cotton, not straw. Blankets smelled faintly of soap. For many, it was the first time in years they would sleep without fear of bombs shaking the walls. Still, as lanterns dimmed and murmurs gave way to silence, the conflict remained unsolved. Gratitude wrestled with dread. Comfort wrestled with guilt. The enemy had fed them like family, but tomorrow, would the mask slip? One woman, staring at the wooden beams above her, clutched the edge of her blanket and whispered to herself, "If this is captivity, what is freedom?" The question echoed in her mind, mingling with the taste of turkey and wine still lingering on her tongue. Sleep crept in, heavy and uneasy. Beyond the wire, America waited, vast and unfathomable. The women did not yet know it, but their first night was only the beginning of a disorienting education, one in which every kindness cut deeper than any weapon, and every meal would demand a reckoning of the soul. They closed their eyes, uncertain, full, and frightened. And as the guards exchanged quiet words at the door, the prisoners dreamed not of escape, but of the next morning, when they would learn what kind of war could be waged with bread and butter instead of bullets. Morning in the camp began not with sirens or barked commands, but with the whistle of a cook ladling oatmeal into tin bowls. Sunlight slanted through barbed wire that looked less menacing in daylight, glinting almost like frost upon a meadow fence. For the women, the strangeness was unrelenting. They had braced for cruelty and discovered routine. They had prepared for hunger and found abundance. Yet every detail of this life behind fences carried the double edge of blessing and suspicion. A steaming bowl of oatmeal was comfort, but also confusion. A guard's polite good morning was courtesy, but also a reminder that freedom was gone. The days followed a rhythm the women had not expected. Breakfast was followed by work details. Some marched to nearby farms where they harvested cotton or picked pecans under the southern sun, others scrubbed floors or stitched uniforms. For their labor, they received slips of camp scrip, a strange currency printed on colored paper, good only at the canteen inside the wire. With it they could buy small luxuries: soap, stationery, even chocolate bars wrapped in silver foil. The first time one of them unwrapped a Hershey bar, she held it like treasure, staring at its glossy surface as though afraid it might vanish. She broke off a square, placed it on her tongue, and closed her eyes. The sweetness was almost painful, too much for a palate used to scarcity. She wrote to her mother that night, "I ate chocolate today." Can you imagine? Here, in a prison. Meals themselves bordered on the surreal. Chicken stew thick with vegetables, slices of cornbread steaming in baskets, milk poured cold from bottles beaded with condensation. The calorie count far exceeded what they had known in Germany, where even civilians queued for hours to receive meager rations of turnips and ersatz coffee. In fact, American regulations required that prisoners be fed according to the same standards as U.S. soldiers, 3,200 calories per day, balanced with meat, bread, fruit, and dairy. Irony hung over every table. The women ate better as captives than their families did as citizens of the Reich. One of them joked, dryly, "We are the only Germans Hitler made fat." The remark sparked laughter so sudden and startled that even the guard smiled. Yet the comfort of food was shadowed by the ache of distance. Letters arrived in careful intervals, censored with black lines that swallowed sentences whole. "We are alive," one scrawled note read. "Do not worry for us." But how could they not? Behind every generous meal, the women imagined their children at home eating watery soup, their mothers trading heirlooms for bread. The contradiction gnawed. They were cared for here, while their own blood starved an ocean away. That guilt, more than the wire, was the true prison. Despite it, small communities formed. In the evenings, the women gathered to sew, to sing old folk songs, to share stories that kept memory alive. A barracks orchestra emerged when the camp commander approved requests for violins and an accordion. The first concert was tentative, strings squeaking with rust, but when the melody of Brahms filled the wooden hall, the air grew thick with longing. Guards stood quietly at the back, listening with an awkward respect. Music blurred the line between captive and captor, if only for a few minutes. Work also brought unexpected encounters. On farms, local families sometimes watched from porches as the prisoners bent over rows of cotton or bundled hay. Children, curious and unafraid, would wave. One little girl approached the fence with a basket of cookies. The guards hesitated, but allowed her to pass a few through the wire. The women received them like relics, each bite sugared with a memory of kitchens they thought they would never see again. Encounters like this chipped away at the caricature of Americans painted by Nazi propaganda. Where were the monsters with claws? Where was the brutality promised in speeches? All they saw were farmers, cooks, guards who tipped their caps and asked if the work was too heavy. Still, not all moments were warm. Some guards kept their distance, cold and rigid, as though kindness might betray their duty. Some locals spat when they passed, reminding the women that beyond the fences lay a country that had buried sons in foreign soil because of Germany's war. The camp, for all its strange generosity, was still a cage. Freedom was glimpsed through the wire but never touched. Every night, the clank of the gates reinforced the truth. They were not guests. They were prisoners. Winter turned to spring, and routines deepened. English classes were offered, lectures on democracy and history that made some scoff, others curious. A few women practiced new words, rolling liberty and justice on their tongues like unfamiliar flavors. The education was subtle propaganda, but it was also opportunity, and many seized it. The shock of their first night's feast had begun to evolve into a quieter realization. America was not merely feeding them, it was attempting to reshape them. Evenings closed with silence, but never stillness. Thoughts swirled. Gratitude for food, guilt for families, suspicion of motives, fear of what would come after. Some wept quietly into their pillows, muffling the sound. Others stared at the ceiling, calculating how long the war might last, wondering whether they would ever walk streets without fences again. And yet, amid the contradictions, a strange transformation was underway. The women who had arrived hollow-eyed, expecting cruelty, now moved with more steadiness, their bodies filling with strength, their voices regaining timbre. The camp sustained them, but it also unsettled them. Every kindness posed a question sharper than any interrogation. Was this mercy real, or simply another weapon in disguise? As twilight settled over the compound one evening, the orchestra played a familiar hymn. Guards leaned on rifles, prisoners swayed with closed eyes, and the sound rose beyond the wire, spilling into the American night. In that moment, the fence seemed both barrier and bridge. The women lowered their heads, aware of the paradox that defined their days. Imprisoned by steel, yet liberated by food, music, and moments of recognition. It was this contradiction that haunted them most. When the final note faded, silence pressed heavy on the camp. Somewhere, a guard locked the gate. A prisoner whispered, almost to herself, "If they feed us like this, what else will they do to us?" The question lingered in the cool air, unanswered, a shadow stretching long into the darkness of what was still to come. Snow melted into spring, and with it the hard shell of certainty many prisoners had carried across the Atlantic began to crack. For years, the women had been told Americans were brutes, soulless materialists who gorged on excess while plotting the destruction of Germany. Yet each sunrise behind the fences delivered contradictions too large to ignore. They woke to porridge, not punishments. They were addressed by name, not number. The steady rhythm of kindness beat louder than any speech they had memorized, and it began to erode the walls inside their minds more surely than barbed wire hemmed them in from without. Letters home revealed the shift in subtle tones. One woman, once a teacher in Bremen, wrote, "Mother, they gave us butter again. Real butter, not the gray paste we knew. I wept when I spread it on bread." Another confessed she had sung while working in a pecan orchard, her voice blending with the laughter of the farmers' children who watched from the fence. These were not tales of torment, but of bewildering comfort. And in that bewilderment, belief itself began to totter. At first, suspicion fought back. When guards extended courtesy, many assumed it masked hidden contempt. When local families sent pies or baskets of fruit, prisoners whispered that it was propaganda staged for their eyes. But suspicion requires proof, and proof never came. Day after day, the gestures remained steady, too consistent to be mere theater. Slowly, reluctant trust took root, fragile as seedlings pressing through thawed earth. One friendship began with a borrowed phrasebook. A woman of 23, her hair cropped short after years of lice outbreaks, asked a young American guard to teach her how to say "thank you" properly. He grinned, corrected her pronunciation, and soon they traded words like tokens. She taught him "danky," he taught her "howdy." What began as awkward exchange bloomed into evenings spent trading jokes across the language gap. They laughed at each other's missteps, laughter that cut through silence thicker than the fence itself. For her, the discovery was seismic. The enemy had a sense of humor. Others found connection in music. The camp orchestra grew bolder, practicing not just Brahms but American folk songs. When guards requested "Home on the Range," the prisoners obliged, fumbling at first, then nailing the melody with such earnestness that the Americans clapped in delight. The women felt a strange pride swell in their chests, pride not for the Reich but for their own ability to bridge a chasm. In that applause, they tasted dignity restored. It was not only guards. Civilians, too, altered their worldview. Farmers who hired prisoner labor sometimes invited them for lemonade breaks under shade trees. One recalled her astonishment when a farmer's wife placed a glass in her hand, cold beads of water sliding down its surface. The woman met her eyes and said gently, "You must be tired." Such tenderness, direct, uncalculated, shattered her composure. She drank quickly, but her tears salted the rim. Moments like these spread through the camp like rumors of another world. Each encounter was small, yet they accumulated into something vast. The realization that the caricature of America painted by Nazi propaganda bore no resemblance to the flesh and blood people around them. The supposed enemy could be stern, yes, but also gentle, playful, generous. It was disorienting, like discovering the earth beneath your feet was not solid stone but shifting sand. Of course, not every prisoner surrendered easily. Some clung to old doctrines, muttering that kindness was weakness, that Americans sought to soften them before some inevitable cruelty. But even those voices grew quieter with time, drowned beneath the evidence of lived experience. A meal could be explained away, perhaps, but not 1,000 meals. A single kindness could be dismissed, but not an unbroken chain of them stretching across seasons. The real war, the women began to see, was not fought with guns inside these fences but with contradictions. Every forkful of mashed potatoes, every polite "good evening," every child's wave from the roadside was a blow against the ideology that had shaped them. And each blow landed deeper than any wound the battlefield had inflicted. Friendship, even in its fragile forms, was both a balm and a torment. It reminded them of the humanity they shared with those they had been taught to hate. It reminded them that the world was wider than their ruined cities, more complex than the slogans screamed from loudspeakers. Yet it also deepened their guilt. If Americans could treat them with respect, what did that say of their own nation's crimes, their own silence when neighbors disappeared into camps with no return? These questions could not be voiced aloud, but they gnawed at the heart of every kind gesture. One night, as summer heat pressed heavy on the barracks, a prisoner lay awake listening to a guard whistle softly outside. The tune was unmistakable, "Silent Night." She remembered singing it by candlelight in bomb-shaken basements, her voice trembling as walls rattled. Now, here in captivity, the same melody rose like a benediction in the dark. She felt something inside her give way, not surrender, but release. She whispered the German words beneath her breath, her voice blending with his across language, across wire. For the first time since capture, she believed she might survive not only the war but herself. Still, the conflict was not resolved. If Americans could be both captors and companions, what did that make the world outside? If kindness could come from enemies, what did that say about loyalty, about truth, about the war's meaning at all? The women carried these questions like secret burdens, heavier than any work detail. As autumn crept in, bringing the rustle of dry leaves against the fences, the camp's orchestra prepared for another concert. This time, the program included both German hymns and American folk songs, a tapestry of notes stitched across the divide. When the final chord rang out, guards and prisoners alike clapped in the same rhythm, the sound rolling like thunder across the compound. In that moment, the women felt the impossible, an echo of unity. And yet, as they filed back to their bunks, the barbed wire still loomed, sharper than ever under the moonlight. Friendship had blossomed, yes, but captivity remained. They lay down knowing tomorrow would bring more bread, more kindness, more questions, and perhaps the most dangerous truth of all, that the enemy was no longer easy to hate. Snow returned on the eve of Christmas, drifting soft as lace over the camp's roofs and fences. Lanterns flickered in the mess hall windows, casting amber squares into the night. Inside, tables had been pushed together, covered with white cloths smoothed by careful hands. Pine branches lined the center, their scent sharp and fresh, mingling with the heavier aromas of roasting turkey and pies cooling on racks. The women filed in slowly, their boots squeaking on wooden planks, their breath rising in clouds. For a moment, they simply stood and stared. The meal that awaited them seemed unreal. Platters of turkey, browned and glistening, sat beside bowls of potatoes whipped to snowy peaks. Cranberry sauce gleamed ruby red, its tartness perfuming the air. Jugs of milk and bottles of wine reflected the light like jewels. For women who had known hunger so fierce it hollowed the bones, the spread was almost cruel in its generosity. Yet there it was, tangible, undeniable. They sat down, some with hands trembling, some whispering prayers. The first bite was more than food. It was memory colliding with revelation. One woman, once a seamstress in Hamburg, lifted a forkful of stuffing rich with herbs. The taste pulled her back to winters before the war, to kitchens where her mother's laughter mixed with the crackle of roasting pans. Another prisoner pressed a slice of pie to her lips and wept openly, the sweetness piercing like a blade. Around the table, others followed. Some laughed too loudly, others fell into stunned silence. The guards stood at the edges, not mocking, not commanding, but present, their expressions unreadable. The meal became more than sustenance. It was theater, ritual, a staging of values. Each dish carried meaning beyond its flavor. The turkey symbolized abundance, the potatoes warmth and solidity, the wine a kind of communion. It was a sermon without words, a demonstration of power not through violence but through generosity. The women understood, even if they could not name it, this was America's quiet war, fought not with bombs but with bread. Yet inside that generosity lay conflict. Gratitude clashed with guilt. As they swallowed mouthfuls of butter and sugar, they imagined their families back home in ruins, rationing thin cabbage soup, shivering in cellars as bombs screamed overhead. A single forkful here equaled days of hunger there. The contrast was unbearable. Some ate quickly, as though to finish before shame could catch them. Others slowed, forcing each bite past the tightness in their throats. One whispered, "My children would not believe this." The words hung heavy, sinking deeper than the snow outside. The orchestra, assembled from prisoners' hands and borrowed instruments, struck up carols. Violins quivered with the opening notes of Still Nacht. The guards joined softly in English, their voices hesitant but earnest. Two languages braided together across the hall, the harmony fragile yet achingly beautiful. The women sang too, their tones unsteady at first, then rising with strength. For those few minutes, the mess hall was transformed into a cathedral without walls, a place where captors and captives breathed the same song. When the music faded, laughter and chatter resumed. A guard poured wine into tin cups, raising his own in a modest toast. "To peace," he said simply. The women exchanged glances, startled. Peace, spoken aloud in a prison. They raised their cups too, some reluctantly, some with a courage they didn't know they had. The wine was tart, staining their tongues red, but the word lingered longer than the flavor. That night, as they lay in their bunks, the women turned over the meaning of what they had lived. The feast was not merely food. It was an assault on the very foundations of the beliefs they had carried. Propaganda had painted America as monstrous, and yet here they were, fed like family on the holiest night of the year. The barbed wire remained outside, sharp and unyielding, but within the fence something had shifted. Each woman felt it differently, some with relief, others with terror, but none could deny it. Their world had been cracked open, and no amount of loyalty to the Reich could seal it shut again. For some, the meal planted seeds of transformation. They saw in the abundance a model of a life beyond scarcity, beyond tyranny. For others, it deepened despair, sharpening the ache of knowing their families were starving in darkness while they were fed in captivity. Yet even despair acknowledged the truth. The enemy had treated them with dignity, and that reality demanded reckoning. The turkey, the wine, the mashed potatoes, these were no longer just dishes. They had become symbols, emblems of another kind of power. Not the clenched fist of ideology, but the open hand of provision. The feast declared, silently yet unmistakably, that humanity could triumph where hatred had ruled. It was both gift and weapon, comfort and challenge. The women understood that their captors were not merely feeding bodies, but reshaping minds. And so the feast lived on in memory long after the plates were cleared. In years to come, when these women returned to their ruined cities, they would tell the story, not of chains or cruelty, but of a night when turkey and wine were set before them, when the enemy's kindness unsettled them more deeply than fear ever had. That story would ripple outward, softening edges of enmity, shaping how a nation would one day rebuild. As the camp fell into silence, a final snow flurry dusted the roofs, erasing footprints from the day. In the barracks, one prisoner whispered into the dark, "They fought us with food." The words were half prayer, half confession. Beyond the wire, America stretched vast and unknowable, but within, the meaning of the feast lingered, a reminder that the most enduring battles are not always won with weapons, but with the simple, devastating power of a meal shared. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.